Greetings, class. This is Unit 1 of Music and Humanity. It's called the Neurology of Music, the Brain, and Evolution. Now, a little explanation. Why are we covering neurology and the brain? Obviously, we're not going to do a class on neurology, and we're not going to do one on anthropology either. But we do need to have a basic understanding of the role that music may have played, and the data seems to really support it, in the evolution of the brain. In other words, the way we came about to be human and the way that we are. Now, you think about that. If music played a role, or some kind of proto-music, in the evolution of the brain, it would go a long way to explain why is music so profoundly important in culture and society. So, we're going to do 5 lessons in this unit. The first lesson is preliminary concepts. That's what we're going to cover today. Lesson 2, we're going to concentrate on the video, the music instinct, which I think you're going to find profoundly interesting. It's a long video, so I'm going to actually steer you towards the parts that I think are most important. Then we're going to do a case study with the speculation of music from the Neolithic era. I think you're going to find that very interesting. Lesson 3, music, the emotions, and evolution. Lesson 4, music and ritual. And then we're going to end up, very much in modern times, with a video called The Electronic Awakening, which is a documentary on the emergence of the electronic dance movement. So we'll look at Burning Man, festivals such as Burning Man, festivals such as Electronic Forest, and others. So, with that, let's get started with the preliminary concepts. We're going to define music very simply. Human structured sound. Pulse, which is this, just steady beat. There's a lot more to that than you would think, because if you look around in nature, no such thing exists. The brain actually creates the beat. And from the beat, of course, we have rhythm. Then we have pitch, high, low, medium, and from there, melody. Then we have the drone. The drone is an interesting concept because most of us don't have any experience with drones. But the drone used to be fundamental to music all over the world. And it's basically any instrument that just creates a kind of sonic background. So where in today would you find the drone? We haven't used it in, for instance, Western civilization since the 1600s, at least not with any frequency. The drone becomes harmony. And out of the drone, that sonic background, is where we actually derive through a thing called the harmonic series. Don't worry, we'll touch that much later. But from the drone, we eventually get not just harmony, but we actually got what we call scales and melodies. So where do we see a drone today? Bagpipes. If you look at the bagpipe, the modern day bagpipe or the ancient bagpipes, they're all similar. What you see is a bag, which just holds all the air. A tube to blow. Now there are bagpipes that you simply push the air with your arm. But most of them have a pipe that you blow through, and then the tenor, which is the one that actually plays the melody. But what are those other tubes doing? Those are the drone, the pipes they call them. And those drone pipes are tuned in fifths and octaves. Now, we're not going to cover that now, but it provides that sonic background against which the melody sounds. So it's the basic harmony is what it is. Or another example is the Indian sitar. You may not notice, but when a sitar player is playing all that melody, it's all done on one string. All the other strings are drones. So human structured sound, that's how we're going to define music for now. Dance, human structured movement. Gesture. Now remember, when we look at proto-music and proto-dance, in the music we're talking about a focused emotion, a focused sound. In dance, we mean gesture. At least when we talk about proto-music, proto-dance, which is before what we would now recognize clearly as music and dance. So gesture is very important, and the sound that's made during the gesture, something like even war kind of cry and holding a spear or stone. But a lot of other gestures, for instance, gestures of nurturing. But the key is that there's a focused emotion, a focused sound, and a structured gesture. These are what we believe to be the prototype that leads to music and dance. So again, human structured sound is music, human structured movement for dance. Now we want to look at the musical experience in its totality, just very briefly. We will be referring mostly to musical practice as opposed to only listening. Why is the music experience so unique? It's because it affects the entire nervous system all at once. The brain lights up, as Daniel Levitin puts it. And Daniel Levitin is somebody that you're going to hear more about in the video. We're going to see the music instinct. And we'll get back to what do we mean by the brain lights up. Okay, since music has the power to influence our emotions, it can change our state of consciousness. This alone is very important on many levels, because music seems to be a powerful tool for self-modification, perhaps the most powerful tool. Humans can change their emotional state, their conscious state, at any time, virtually at will, just by engaging in musical practices. Now, when you look at it that way, you can see how important that is, of the implications. In other words, an early human, we're looking at reacting to the environment. So your mind, your state of consciousness, is largely the work of reacting to stimulus from the environment. But what happens when you can actually alter your state of mind and your emotions, and it's not related to the environment? This is a major step toward human evolution, when you can willfully manipulate your own emotions. And that's what I mean by music as a powerful tool for self-modification. Furthermore, music can be created anywhere. All that's necessary is the human body. Sing, dance, clap hands. Now think about it. There's a lot of musical cultures that you don't need an instrument in. In my field work, I'll show you in flamenco how that's done very frequently. On a street corner without a guitar. People can just clap, sing, and dance. And you can change your state of mind and your emotions willfully, on demand, anywhere. As we go along in the course, you're going to see how important that is. Now, it's also critical that we see that music can actually modify the physiology of the brain. Now, that's really provocative. You're going to see an actual example of that in the music instinct. So let's look briefly at the human nervous system, the neuron and the brain itself. So as you can see from the illustration, the nervous system permeates the entire body, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. We're only concerned really with the brain. The brain and the spinal column constitutes the central nervous system. But obviously, indirectly, we're concerned with the entire nervous system because music moves the body, the singing, and there's information traveling from the outer, the peripheral nervous system, to the central nervous system, right? And back out again. Information is fed, interpreted, and information is sent out. So let's look at the neuron. It's also called neurons or nerve cells. They're the fundamental unit of the brain and nervous system. The cells responsible for receiving sensory input from the external world, for sending motor commands to our muscles, and for transforming and relaying the electrical signals at every step in between. And most of this is just detail, but the neurons can be called afferent neurons. Those are the ones that convey information from the tissues, or the peripheral nervous system, to the brain and the central nervous system. And the effector cells are the ones that do the reverse. From the brain, they go to the nervous system. So let's look at the neuron. The structure of the typical neuron is, as you can see in the illustration, it's actually one basic cell, though it does have these things called Schwann cells. But for our practical purposes, we look at the dendrites, and that's where information comes in, right? They're chemical stimulations. And the axon terminals are information or instructions going out. So the neuron is what stores information and transmits and receives information, depending on its function and where it is in the brain. As you can see from the diagram, all these different parts of the brain all process musical stimulus, especially in the music practice. And we want to make that very clear. The real importance of music is the music making. That's what has the most profound effect on the brain. So you look at the cerebellum, that's the oldest part of the brain. It's involved in musical processing. It's involved in emotions, but in those cases, there are more emotions like fright, flight, rage, deep attraction. But it goes all the way through the hypothalamus, the corpus callosum, which is important because we're going to see an experiment with that in the music instinct. And then all the way to the frontal lobes, the newest part of the brain. That's where we have the language centers, the symbolic thinking centers. Also, they process music. So the brain is not just a passive resonator, it's an active generator of musical experience. The parts of the brain operate in concert with one another to experience and generate musical experiences. In other words, the entire brain becomes involved in musical practices. When we say the brain lights up, what do we mean by that? Obviously, it's not lights going off in your brain. We have three brain monitoring technologies. One is the electroencephalogram, or EEG. And basically, it detects electrical activity in your brain. Uses small metal disc electrodes attached to the scalp. This is the one that's really moving fast, this technology. Because right now, you can actually buy EEGs that you can put on your head and see the readouts. It's very useful in a lot of things like meditation and finding out where your brain waves are. But it's just one. The other one is the functional magnetic resonance imaging. You're going to see an example of that in the Music Instinct video, or the fMRI. Then we have the magnetoencephalography. It's actually pronounced magnetoencephalography. It's a real mouthful, usually MEG. And it records magnetic fields. So when we say the brain lights up, what are we saying? Well, these three monitoring technologies, they'll take a read on the movements and concentrations of, say, oxygen, blood, where the electrical currents are moving, where the electromagnetic currents are moving. And they'll turn that information into a visual graph. Sometimes it's a picture, oftentimes it's an actual kind of imaging. It's like a video. And you'll see the brain actually lighting up because the technology is transforming the movements and what it's detecting into color patterns. So you can even distinguish certain areas with different colors and certain kinds of activity with different colors. And so to the scientists, to the neurologists, they'll refer to this as lighting up. Obviously, it's not lighting up. It's not lights going off in your brain like you got LEDs in there. So let's look at brain plasticity. The revelation in brain plasticity, or neurogenesis, is that neurons can regenerate. The second really interesting part is that this process can be easily stimulated by musical activity. Now, we used to think that there was so many neurons in the brain, and by puberty, it was set. You didn't generate more brain cells. I mean, you could learn more, you could make more connections between them, but the number of cells was set. And therefore, by old age, when neurons are dying off and no more being reproduced, this is what accounted for a lot of, mental problems, memory loss, dementia, and things like that. Really, degenerative diseases of old age. But now we know that actually the brain throughout life can continue to generate neurons. So at first we thought it was to compensate for a damage. For instance, you had a damaged part of the brain, something was going wrong, maybe a stroke, maybe a concussion or whatever. And if it was severe enough, it would damage a part of the brain. So the neurogenesis could work around it. It's kind of like a road and there's a hole in it, or a really huge pothole, and it would work around it. It would create pathways and connections that would try to compensate for it. And it makes sense. But why would music stimulation generate neurons? That's kind of interesting. Why would music stimulate something so critical as neurogenesis? There's no damage being compensated for. There's no healing taking place. Or is there? Is it learning? Well, learning what? Now, the next really important concept is cognitive fluidity. Cognitive fluidity is a key characteristic of the Homo sapien brain. It separates us from all other animals, as far as we know. It allows all the parts of the brain to work in concert, while at the same time allowing each part of the brain to be interacting and responding to all the other parts of the brain in real time, in the moment. In fact, we would consider cognitive fluidity to be the culmination thus far of our evolution. There's a phrase in neurology that goes like this: neurons that fire together wire together. Experiments have been done where they can stimulate a neuron and keep repeating it, and it will stimulate the next neuron. But what's really important is that when that neuron is stimulated, they make a connection between the two. That's how it'll actually connect to it. So let's look at that in reference to the musical experience. The musical practice stimulates many parts of the brain at once. Also, when they fire together, they wire together. That means this musical activity is not just firing them and creating more brain plasticity, it's also wiring them together. It's reinforcing their relationships. Now we have even a more convincing argument for cognitive fluidity arising from proto-musical music dance practices. And it allows for the brain to come up with things like a metaphor. For instance, you say Richard the Lionheart. Richard's not a lion. Probably doesn't have a lion's heart in him. And there's no lion called Richard. But we can put those things together in our brain and we can formulate what we call a metaphor. Richard, we believe lions are noble and brave. Richard is noble and brave like a lion. His heart or his inner being is like that of a lion. Right? I mean, outside of a metaphor, it doesn't make any sense. But we know perfectly well what's meant. This is the kind of thing that a modular brain can't do. And all the other creatures on the planet tend to have what we call modular brains. The brain does this, this part does that, this part does this. But their intercommunication is not very good. It's why you see in a lot of animals, even though they're very smart at some things, there are certain things they don't put together that even a young human, by the time he's 12 years old, puts together very, very easily. So this is called cognitive fluidity. And as we move along, I think you'll get a better grasp for it. But how did cognitive fluidity arise and when? And is there a relationship between it and brain plasticity? That's a very good question. Well, we're going to talk about that. So, how did cognitive fluidity arise and when? Is there a relationship between it and brain plasticity? And is there a relationship between it and music? Is there a direct relationship between brain plasticity, neurogenesis, and cognitive fluidity, cross-modular thinking? If there is, then is there a direct relationship between musical practices and cognitive fluidity? Because if there is, then there very well might be or have been a direct relationship between musical, proto-musical practices and human evolution. Is that possible? So now we're going to look at the theory of spelled H-M-M-M-M-M. I don't know how many M's. I think they spell it with 5, sometimes 7. But it seeks to answer, how did cognitive fluidity come about? If it's the most characteristic thing of the human being, what we call the Homo sapien, how did this happen? The theory of was formulated by Stephen Mithen, who you were going to see in the video, and he's the one that undergoes an actual experiment. He wrote the book called The Singing Neanderthals, another catchy title, and it models a direct relationship between what I call the symphonic brain, brain plasticity or neurogenesis, and cognitive fluidity with an evolutionary framework. He models the actual evolutionary process through what he calls an incremental feedback loop. So let's look now at the incremental feedback loop. This is a concept developed by theory and a model developed by Stephen Mithen. At the top there, you see structured sound and gesture making. So we already know that musical practices generate brain plasticity. They stimulate brain plasticity. So the structured sound and gesture stimulates the brain plasticity. The brain plasticity increases brain capacity. Obviously, there's more neurons. The brain capacity then creates the potential for increased complexity in structured sound and gesture making. There's more capacity. It's, as we know, music stimulates a lot of neurons throughout the brain. It's not just focused in one place, but they're interrelated. That's the important part. They're interrelated. So this creates the potential for an increased complexity in the structured sound and gesture making, which then leads to more complex structured sound gesture making, which in turn stimulates brain plasticity, which in turn increases brain capacity, which in turn creates the potential for a more complex, maybe a more nuanced or intense emotion, maybe for more gestures, more complicated sounds related to the gestures. And this, over time, we're talking about thousands of years, leads to what he is theorizing, cognitive fluidity. Now, you look at it at first, it seems a little bit simplistic. However, when you see it in action, when you actually see the brain in a human being generating physically, you can see it in the brain scan over a relatively short period of time, more neurons. This is what gives this model a lot of credence. And I'm going to add more to it a little bit later on in part 3. But this is the basic model. Now, for those of you familiar with music, again, we'll use the band example. You know what feedback is, right? You put a noise in the microphone, right? You sing in the microphone. The microphone then sends the signal to the amplifier. The amplifier amplifies it, and then it puts it into the speaker. But if the microphone is actually facing the speaker or too close to the speaker, it's not just picking up what you're singing into it. It's picking up the amplified sound coming out of the speaker, which turns around and gets amplified, which makes the noise in the amplifier, in the speaker, even louder. And then that's going into the microphone. And so you see it creates a loop that just gets louder and louder and more out of control. Now, I'm just trying to give you an example of a feedback loop. So look again there at the illustration. The structured sound gesture making stimulates brain plasticity. Brain plasticity increases brain capacity. Brain capacity creates potential and probably stimulates music making at a slightly higher degree, however small. That in turn leads to the structured sound gesture and making as being more complex, considered a little louder. And it goes around and around and around. So given, again, enough time, could this be what led to cognitive fluidity? Well, you're going to see a very visceral example of, in a short period of time, over a number of months, Stephen Mithen actually generates neurons in his brain through simple musical practices, I think a half an hour a day. So let's go on now to take a very quick look at evolution. So you get an idea of the time spans we're talking about. We look at the Homo sapien here, modern Homo sapien. It's called Homo sapiens sapien. That's 35,000 years ago. It's really not much. But the Homo sapien, which is the prelude, and anatomically, they're not exactly the humans that we have today on the planet. So physically speaking, they're still a little bit different, and many of them will actually die out, one of them being the Neanderthal. But you can see that about 250,000 years, we have what looks like proto-human or Homo sapien. And it translates into man or human of knowledge. We're going to do a variation on that. So look at this figure. excuse me, this illustration. We see proto-language. Now, there's a lot of debate between the relationship between language and music, which preceded the other. We'll touch on that later, but for right now, where it says proto-language and language, just think proto-music or theory. Proto-music, gesture. Pre-language, pre-music, pre-dance. It's about close to 1 million years ago. That's what we're saying that it first began. There's a lot of anthropological discussion about this. They don't know exactly where this started to develop. But by the time we get to 400,000 years ago, we're pretty sure that there's something symbolic, something language-like. Now remember, it's very difficult to trace music. That's the problem. But in the video, you will see that we start discovering flutes, small little instruments, way further back than we thought. So then let's go back to this picture. 250,000 years ago, we have the Homo sapien, not the Homo sapiens sapien. It's in this timeline that we're talking about 500,000 years to now. It's a long time. So now you look at that incremental feedback loop that Mithun is suggesting and gives it a little bit more veracity, right? So we look here on this little illustration, and you'll see the structured sound and gesture, incremental feedback loop, eventually cognitive fluidity. And with that, we have music and dance. But what about symbolic thinking, which would be language? I'm of the school that is convinced, and I think the data is showing more and more, that music and dance preceded what we would call language. However, it's still not clear. What we're really talking about is symbolic thinking. So let me give you just a brief example how music can function as symbolic transmitter, even though its main function is not to be a symbolic transmitter. Let's say somebody at World War II, somebody was in World War II, they go visit Normandy, and he hears them play the Star-Spangled Banner while they raise the flag. It triggers a huge amount of emotions. You can see, of course, that it's not really the music itself doing it. It's that the music is carrying the symbol of his own stored memories. And this is the key to symbolic thought, that it represents or points to something that is not present and then evokes it in the mind. But think back on with the first day that you heard the music that you decided was your favorite music. When you first heard it, did it remind you of something? Probably not. What is it about the music that you really like when you first heard it? And if you're a musician or you want to be, you usually want to be this kind of musician, right? So think about the first time you heard that music. That feeling was visceral in the body. Your brain resonated with that particular music more so than any other. It had nothing to do with symbolic thinking. It had nothing to do with reminding you of something. It was simply its own power. That's the real power of music. However, music can function symbolically, as in the example I just gave you. So therefore, that's why I and others really lean towards something much more closer to a proto-music, proto-dance, eventually led to language. And they probably did not evolve at the same time, and music and dance preceded. Again, though, there's still speculation at this time. So in conclusion, for lesson 1, the modern Homo sapien sings, dances, and speaks. And cognitive fluidity is what makes that possible. But it also puts singing and dancing on the same level of speaking in terms of evolution. So the key point for us is that proto-musical and musical practices may have actually contributed to the evolution of the human brain. And not just contributed, but were critical. And that might well explain why humans spend so much time and energy pursuing musical practices. I will have more to say about this in the music and culture unit, and I'll be adding another dimension to the evolutionary model for cognitive fluidity. But an interesting question to ask is whether or not music might still be playing a role in our evolution. As it is, the study of music in the brain has led to many breakthroughs in the study of the brain, observations and insights that might have otherwise been nearly impossible or taken much longer to have arrived at. That is, if you study the relationship between music and the brain, you actually have a kind of fast track to studying the brain, which is another indication that music itself may have played such a critical role in the evolution of the brain as we know it. And the critical factor here is cognitive fluidity. If music played a critical role in cognitive fluidity, it means that we might call ourselves Homo musicalis, not just Homo sapien. So now let's proceed to the documentary, The Music Instinct.